The late 19th and 20th century had seen Britain's preeminence economically and politically on the world stage be challenged as other nations like Germany and America had grown economically as a result of industrialisation. However, Britain remained incredibly important, and this can especially be seen in the negotiations after World War I and the position that Britain occupied in the League of Nations. The 1930s had been really difficult in Britain, as it had been elsewhere, as the Great Depression took a hold. However, even greater economic damage was done during World War II, where Britain had to face 6 years of warfare, at some points fighting by themselves, with limited manufacturing. The economic realities of post-war Britain meant that it became very difficult for Britain to act unilaterally on an international scale, and this can particularly be seen during the Suez Crisis. World War II had led to a rising sentiment of internationalism in the global community and nationalism in colonies as a result of the fighting for the ideals of democracy. This made it very difficult for Britain to continue to justify holding on to her colonial possessions. These possessions were economically very important to the British state. We're going to explore these themes of democracy and decline through Malaya.
The main reasons for the British Empire's sudden decline after World War II was mainly based on two reasons. The first reason is the difficulty of controlling the colonies with growing independence effort due to the changing times, through which the British realized that the change of times ushered in a new world order whereby they were not as superior as it was before. The second is that it cost money to uphold the colonies, and the British didn't have that right after World War II, as a huge amount of money was required to repair the damages that were caused to Britain during the war. The Labour government's decision to transform from a warfare state to a welfare state also demanded a huge amount of money and resources, and as such, Britain had no money nor resources left to govern its colonies as it did prior to the war, and therefore, decolonisation occurred. The wave of decolonisation after World War II was simply a case of imperial reality catching up with economic reality. Britain spent vast amounts trying to remain a great global power, but it was no longer possible for its empire to pay for it. World War II was a huge drain on financial resources for the British Empire. The British Empire was able to hold onto its colonies prior to World War II because of the delicate balance it held between colony and owner. However, this was not to be the case, as Britain's economic position in the immediate aftermath of World War II did not allow it to maintain its colonies as they used to prior to the war. Its colonies began to descend, and Britain had no choice but to decolonize, thus showing how Britain's own economic fragility played a role in decolonisation. The British Nationality Act of 1948, which acknowledged and granted British citizenship to all peoples from areas of land part of the British Empire, is very significant because it shows the changing of the way the British viewed themselves in the world view, and highlights their transformation from a warfare state to that of a welfare state. The founding of the National Health Service in July 1948 by the Labour government signalled their intent to shift from a warfare state to the welfare state. Occurring in the immediate aftermath of World War II, it was achieved only after 2 years of bitter resistance by the medical establishment. This therefore showed how urgent and desperate the Labour government wanted to implement the NHS. It also shows how Britain transformed from a warfare state to a welfare state, placing its emphasis and therefore resources on its territorial citizens and local issues instead of focusing on its overseas colonies, which inadvertently led to decolonisation.
Yet, the process of decolonisation for Britain must also be viewed in the larger historical context of the Cold War. In the ensuing ideological battle between democracy and communism, Britain was unwilling to grant independence to colonies who were susceptible to the influence of communism. When the Malayan emergency broke out in 1948, Britain was suddenly obliged to look eastward. The Cold War in Southeast Asia had become a reality. Its decision to grant independence to its colonies in Southeast Asia would be put on hold. Only when a stable democratic government is formed and intercommunal relations is established will Britain grant them independence. So what exactly was the Malayan emergency and how did it come about? Following World War II, a new problem emerged for Malaya. After the Japanese surrendered, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, or MPAJA, which was supported by the British to fight the Japanese invasion, was asked to withdraw their weapons and integrate in a society as civilians. Before the British re-established their authority, however, the Malayan Communist Party, or MCP, tried to force Malaya into anarchy by attempting to gain control of the police stations in order to free Malaya from colonialism. In 1948, Chinese communist guerrilla fighters emerged from the jungle and, under the rule of Jinping, began their terror campaign to take over the country by force. The Malayan government at the time, along with many others in the Western Bloc, was apprehensive about the spread of international communism. Thus, an intense jungle war began, fought by the Malay forces and British Commonwealth forces against the MCP. Sir Henry Gurney, who was the High Commissioner in the Federation of Malaysia, had said, "The plain fact is that Malaya is the only place in all three areas where we are actively fighting against communism, and moreover, it is territory for which we are responsible. Clearly, we cannot afford to lose Malaya to communism." Thus, it is evident that the process of decolonisation for Britain must also be viewed in the larger historical context of the Cold War.
There were also other reasons for the decolonisation, such as the role of the nationalists. Before World War II, there was minimal nationalist movements. However, the myth of the white superiority was shattered as the Malayan people saw that Asians could win over the whites. Almost immediately after the war, the British proposed the Malayan Union Scheme in 1946 that promoted loose immigration policies and reduced Malay sovereignty over Malaya. The Malays were particularly upset, and this led them to be more politically conscious to fight for their rights. The United Malay National Organisation, UMNO, was formed in protest of the Malayan Union Scheme and was successful in getting the British to make amendments to the new scheme for Malaya. Despite achievements in their goals, they became more nationalistic and worked towards independence from the British. The nationalists also condemned communists when communism increasingly became a problem to the British through the violent menace, and the Malayan emergency commenced from 1948 to 1960 to suppress them. UMNO began making alliances with the other race parties such as Malayan Indian Congress and Malayan Chinese Association to become the Alliance Party, to prove to the British that they could work together despite some racial tensions. It became clear to the British that independence was the answer to communism, as the communists were claiming to fight to free themselves from the British. And since the Alliance Party seemed popular and stable, thus the British were more willing to grant them independence. The Alliance Party won a landslide victory, winning 51 out of 52 seats for elections, proving the nationalistic sentiments of Malaya, and thus independence was granted in 1957.
In the case of Malaya, or Malaysia as it came to be known after 1957, there is a new colonial interpretation of the country's modern economic and political history. There resides the notion that independence for the Federation of Malaya in 1957, followed by the creation of Malaysia 6 years later, was a sort of pseudo-independence. Under the leadership of Tengku Abdul Rahman, British business did indeed occupy a strong position in the newly independent state. They dominated positions not only in the long-established rubber and tin industries, but also in the new fields of secondary industry and oil palms. As author Hua Yu Win argued in the 1980s, the Malaysian ruling class remained under the domination of a British metropolitan middle class, as the latter continued to monopolize control of economy. A continuity of imperialist domination and the colonial character of the post-independence export economy was exemplified by a lack of diversity into secondary industry. In the late 1960s, less than 1/10 of the labor force was employed in the manufacturing sector. In 1964, 7 years after gaining independence from her colonial master, there were about 40 British companies having local registrations in Malaysia, and the rubber and tin industries had accounted for 60% of the stock exchange capitalization. Even without the colonial crutch, British business groups showed themselves at the forefront of developments in Malaysia and capable of considerable perseverance. To add further to this new colonial thesis, the UK government's decolonialisation strategy had been predicated on the principle that a significant degree of influence would be preserved in the successor states of the new Commonwealth. As British historian and academic John Darwin states, the later praises of British colonial policy were frequently geared to making sure that the emerging state would be a useful and stable partner for Britain after independence. In the economic realm, Development was to be encouraged along lines compatible with British interests and in cooperation with British overseas enterprises. British business interests would seem to have chanced upon their dream, neo-colonial state. The survival and revival of British business in a post-independence Malaya was critical in the pursuit of a sphere of influence empire in Asia, both economically and geopolitically. As illustrated, British businesses were loud and able to prosper in newly independent Malaysia.
This case study of Malaysia has highlighted 4 key points that we have to bear in mind when discussing decolonisation. Firstly, decolonisation must be considered through the prism of international relations. The communist threat in Malaysia was a key reason why decolonisation took the form in which it did. Secondly, there was still a Britain first mentality, and with huge amounts of money being invested in the NHS and the new welfare state. Thirdly, nationalist sentiments in the colony made it very difficult for Britain to refuse independence, especially given the fact that they had just fought a war based on ideals of democracy. From 1960, when Harold Macmillan made his Winds of Change speech, decolonisation was a political reality and occurred rapidly throughout the empire. And finally, decolonisation does not necessarily mean that a colonial nation loses all influence. Neo-colonialism is a powerful force, and Britain retained powerful influence in Malaysia, making the government less resistant to decolonisation, as they could reap economic benefits of Malaysian trade without the financial responsibility of colonialism. When David Cameron visited Malaysia in 2012, he said that our relationship with Malaysia is hugely important, and I want to continue developing a broad-based partnership based on shared values and strong cooperation on education, skills, trade and defence. Thus, while Malaysia gained independence in 1957, the relationship with Britain was far from over.